Thanks for checking out the weekly sermon from Church of the Resurrection. I pray that God will use this message to speak to you and help you grow in your faith journey. If you're in the KC area, I'd like to invite you to join us next week at one of our services, or join us in live worship online at core.org/worship. Church of the Resurrection is one church in multiple locations. To learn more about the service times in our ministries, please visit core.org. Hope you enjoy this week's message. To honor all copyright restrictions, we have removed some video and audio elements from this message.
My name is Jason Gant, and I serve as the campus pastor at Resurrection West. And on this day, we declare that Christ is risen. And now we turn to a passage from the Gospel of Luke. On Easter afternoon, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. May God add a blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of Scripture.
The Gospel of Luke records 7 meals that Jesus eats with others. Discover your place at Jesus' table. Breaking bread with Jesus, food and life in the Gospel of Luke.
Once again, we want to thank you so much for joining us for worship this year. Thank you for being here for our Easter services. We're so glad you joined us. And I want to say this has got to be the most unusual Easter in my life and probably in your lives. This is the first year that I can ever imagine in history where the church doors were locked on Easter, the biggest day of the year for the church. And yet Easter came anyway. It's coming to you right now. It's coming throughout this day as we're remembering the message of Easter. And we have never needed Easter more, at least in my life, than we do this year. So we're going to focus on the Easter story, but I want to begin by recognizing that about a month ago, just over a month ago, the American society, our life together came screeching to a halt. Now, of course, for some people, it began racing faster than ever before, people in healthcare and working in the grocery stores and other areas. But for most of us, we saw a fundamental change in how we did life together. So suddenly, we found our kids were out of school. Kids in the public schools, colleges, and universities. We found that the theaters were closed, and the movie theaters were closed, and the theme parks were closed, and Major League Sports was canceled for the season or postponed. We found that the life that we knew, eating in restaurants, breaking bread together outside of our home, that stopped. And in so many ways, we found the world changed. We found that we originally couldn't meet in groups larger than 1,000. Then it was 500. Then it was 200. Then it was 50. Now it's 10. So as a church, no funerals, no weddings, unless they're just 2 or 3 people. We aren't able to go to the hospitals to visit people in the hospital. And this is true in almost every field. Everything has been disrupted. And then, of course, we know that what started out as something that was way over there, coronavirus in China, and then just on the West Coast in one small area in Washington, suddenly came to all of us. So last weekend, we had 2 members of our congregation, dearly loved members of our 7:30 service, Mo and Peggy Denton, who passed away both from COVID-19, just within a day of each other, 2 days of each other. And so we felt this. We began to recognize that there was a need to flatten the curve, a deep desire on the part of officials, especially in the healthcare arena, to not stress our healthcare system any more than we needed to. And so looking at all the things that we could do to keep social distance from one another. Now, while all of that was going on, we also saw what happened in the economy. So the stock market dropped by 37% in a matter of days. And then 16 million people unemployed. And so the world has radically changed, and it feels very dark for many people, frightening, uncertain, disillusionment, despair for some. For others, things are going okay. In fact, it's kind of nice to have a bit of a break, to be able to be home and to spend more time there and working out of the house for those who are able to do that. And you're continuing to receive a salary, and so things are okay there, and you're slowing down, and it feels like a forced Sabbath of a sort. And so there's a silver lining for many people. But even those for whom there's a bit of a silver lining are finding that 4 weeks of being at home, being at the home without being able to really get out and do your normal things that you would do, can make you a little stir crazy. One of our dads in our congregation told me this week that he was concerned about his son. His son seemed not to be himself. And he said, "Hey, son, are you okay? Are you depressed? Are you afraid?" And he said, "Dad, I'm not depressed or afraid. I'm just sick of being around you guys. And I've had enough family time to last a lifetime." And so we began to see that, maybe enough family time is enough. And we begin, desiring to go out and do some other things. I was thinking about a man in the Netherlands who decided he was going to violate the state orders to stay in place and shelter in place. And instead, he boarded a plane to go to the Caribbean, and he wanted to go to a Caribbean island, to St. Martin's, and he filmed this as he was taking off in his plane. Take a look. Sometimes we have to laugh, and sometimes laughter is the best medicine when we're afraid or anxious about what's going on around us. And when I was watching that video for the first time, I thought, who is this bozo who has taken a trip like this? And then all of a sudden I realized he's sitting in front of his dryer. So we have time to think of crazy and silly things in the middle of all this. Now today we're searching for hope. That's why we've come to Easter service, right? We're searching for hope, and Easter is about hope. In fact, Easter is the most fundamental message of hope that you can find. And so when we look at Easter, we find Christ has triumphed over the grave, and that means these things. It means that light has overcome darkness, love has triumphed over hate, and life has had the victory over death. You can't get more hope than that. Now, I want to remind you the Easter story begins on Maundy, Thursday. Jesus has had the Last Supper with his disciples, and at the end of that supper, he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's going to be arrested. He prays, "Not my will, but thy will be done." Soon, Judas comes escorting a group of guards. They arrest Jesus. They take him to the Jewish Sanhedrin. These people some of them had been angry at Jesus because he had called them out for hypocrisy. Some of them were upset by his own unorthodox ideas or ways of doing ministry. Some were angry that he'd thrown out the money changers from the temple, and they felt Jesus had to go, and they convicted him of blasphemy against God. Then the next morning, he was taken to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, and there the Roman governor was told that he was leading a rebellion against Rome, and so he was convicted of insurrection. And he was tortured, nailed to a cross, and spent 6 hours there, slowly dying. Finally, at 3 p.m, he was taken down from the cross. He was placed in a borrowed tomb. And when the stone, that big, massive stone, was rolled in front of the tomb, it seemed as though that was that. But for Jesus, that definitely was not that. The disciples began practicing their own kind of social distancing. They were terrified. They were terrified that maybe they would be next. They were horrified by what they had seen, traumatized by the thought and the sight from a distance of their friend and the one they thought was the Messiah being tortured to death on the cross. They lost their hopes and dreams on that day. They were buried with Jesus in the tomb. For some of them, perhaps even their faith. Now, early on Sunday morning, the women were the ones who went to the tomb first. They went there to finish the burial preparations. Jesus had been hastily buried. They brought with them items to be able to open the tomb and to be able to prepare him appropriately for burial. And as they did this, or as they approached the tomb, they saw the stone had already been rolled away. Not just rolled away, tossed aside. And when they went inside the tomb, to their horror, Jesus was not there, and they were certain that somebody had stolen his body. But then 2 men dressed in white are standing there by the tomb, and they speak to them. And this is what they say, these very famous Easter words. Would you read them with me? They'll be on the screen. "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen." This is the Easter proclamation. Jesus is not dead. He is very much alive. He is not here in the tomb. And they didn't know what to make of that. They run quickly back to where the disciples were, and they say to them, "Look, we've just seen 2 men who told us that Jesus is raised from the dead, and he's not in the tomb." And the men thought the women were crazy. They really literally thought that they had lost their minds because of their grief. Now, I love this part of the text because it points to something fundamentally true. I sometimes will often talk to people who have little or no faith or struggling with faith. And often people will say to me, "Look, I love what Jesus said. I love what he did. I love the man that he is. I would really follow him. But that whole supernatural stuff I really have a hard time with." Like the resurrection is often what they point to. And I say to them, "You know what? You are in good company. I'm glad that you want to follow Jesus and you love him and you're interested in what he had to say and you want to do those things. And it's okay that you're struggling a bit with the supernatural things, because in the company that you keep are the disciples themselves, who on that first Easter morning when the women came to them and said, look, the tomb is empty and his body isn't there, and the angels told us he's alive, and Peter and John ran to the tomb and they found the tomb was empty, but they didn't see Jesus, and they didn't know what to think of this. They heard the testimony of the women, but they did not believe in the resurrection themselves until they saw Jesus for themselves. And so you're in good company if you struggle with this a bit. And our hope and prayer, of course, is that you might actually come to see Jesus and believe in the resurrection. Now that afternoon, 2 of Jesus' followers leave the rest of the disciples, and they decide that they're going to go back to their own homes. They're going to be socially isolating in their houses. Their house is in the town of Emmaus, which is about 7 miles from Jerusalem. It's a 2-hour walk. And this is what we read. Now on that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. I love this. Jesus shows up as a stranger. He doesn't show up and say, hey, here I am. It's me. Look, I'm raised from the dead. He shows up as a stranger and starts walking with these guys. And then he starts asking them questions. So here's the first question he asks. What are you talking about as you walk along? And Luke says, at that, they stood still looking sad. Or William Barclay says, their faces were contorted by grief. Do you feel the pain that they're feeling? The darkness that they feel like they've been enveloped by since Jesus' death? So they don't know what to say at first. Jesus asks the question. They don't know what to say. And then they say, well, are you the only stranger here in town who doesn't know what happened to this man in Jerusalem and the things that happened to him? And Jesus says, well, what things? He asks another question. What things? And they said, well, the things about Jesus of Nazareth. That's what things. And they go on to describe their hopes in Jesus, their hope that he was the Messiah, a prophet of God, that he was one who was going to save and deliver Israel, and then how he had been arrested and he had been tortured to death, and how he'd been buried in the tomb, and how all of their hopes were lost. They describe all of this, and then Jesus asks another question. He says, well, didn't the Messiah have to suffer and die and be raised from the dead? And they're confused, they're perplexed. I want to pause here. The question I was asking as I was reading this text this week is, why does Jesus show up as a stranger? Why doesn't he just show himself to them? And why does he keep asking them questions? And then it struck me how this really works. I was at a Passover Seder on Wednesday. Wednesday was the Passover, the Jewish Passover, and my good friend, Rabbi Art Nematoff, and by the way, he sends his greetings. I think he's going to be worshiping with us this Easter. He and his wife, Leslie, invited us to join them for their Passover Seder. So we did this, a virtual Seder. There were 23 households joined together on a video screen on a Zoom call, and we shared the Passover. And what was interesting is that at the Passover, the way the Passover works is children ask questions. And then you have to wrestle with the answers to the questions, and you explain it. And it's in the questioning and the answering that you find you get the story. And then Rabbi Art, he said, I want all of you to answer a question. So he sent questions out to all of us. And we had 180 words by which we could answer that question. Mine was, how do you talk about God? And so, while you're coming up with the answer, you're somehow participating in this Seder before you ever get there. And you're thinking about religious things, thinking about God and God's work and deliverance of ancient Israel. I mean, there's something about asking the right questions instead of just giving people the answers. I saw this again a couple of weeks ago. We have a time, Lavon has a time, where she reads to our granddaughter Stella. Stella's 6 years old. She's in kindergarten and, of course, not in school right now. So Stella has an iPad in Lawrence, and Lavon has her iPad, and they read to each other. And so I sat in on this session, and Stella has a book at her house, and she's starting to read the book. And as she's reading it, she'll hold up the pages, and she doesn't know how to say one of the words. And so I'm going to tell her, I start to say, well, Stella, this is how you say it. And Lavon reaches out her hand, stops me, and says, Papa, don't give her the answer. Let her work on this herself. And I thought, gosh, Lavon was exactly right. I tend to want to just blurt out the answer, but you see, the learning happens in wrestling with the question or wrestling with the thing that you don't have, figured out and finally figuring it out. That's how we learn. I think about going to therapy. If you've ever been to therapy, a good therapist doesn't give you don't go in and say, okay, here's my problem, and then the therapist suddenly gives you the answer. Instead, the therapist just keeps asking questions and forcing you to wrestle with things and finding the answers inside yourself and then giving you hints along the way. That's precisely what was happening here in this story. So Jesus is asking questions, and he's trying to help them find the answers. This continues for 2 hours. And along the way, Jesus decides that he's going to walk them through the entire Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, from the Torah, the books of Moses, all the way to the prophets, and he's going to show them how the Messiah had to suffer and die and then rise again. How I wish I had been there to hear how Jesus made that argument, what he would have said about the text. But Luke doesn't tell us what he said. I wished he had, but he doesn't tell us, because Luke wants us to go all the way through the Torah and then to the prophets and to find the answer for ourselves. That's how we learn. That's how we grow. So finally they get to Emmaus, and when they get to Emmaus, we read these words that Jesus, or actually the stranger, prepares to go ahead. Like he's going to leave them. It's sunset, and he's going to keep walking. He's pretending to keep walking because he's testing them. And then this is what we read. They urged him, saying, "Stay with us. It's nearly evening, and the day is almost over." And they passed the test. You may remember that Jesus, talked quite a lot about how you welcome people, the stranger and others, and how you share what you have with other people. And these two disciples got it. They invited Jesus to join them. Now, this is what happened. Jesus agrees to go eat with them, and then we read, after he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Do those words sound familiar to you at all? They should if you're a Christian, you've been in church very much, because they're the very words that we say when we share Holy Communion. We say Jesus took the bread, he gave thanks to God, he blessed it, he broke it, and he gave it to his disciples. It's what we recounted a few weeks ago when we told the story of the feeding of the 5,000, where there was only a handful of loaves of bread and some fish, and Jesus takes the bread, he gives thanks, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it to his disciples to distribute to others. This very scene they had seen again and again and again in the life of Jesus, and this is what we read. Their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, but he disappeared from their sight. And Luke goes on to summarize that experience and why it's important. He said that Jesus was known to them in the breaking of the bread. There was something about that meal and seeing Jesus and hearing the words that Jesus had spoken and watching the bread be broken, where suddenly they saw Jesus is with us. Right? And after Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension, the early church continued to break bread with each other in their homes. And as they did that, they remembered Jesus. In the breaking of the bread, they remembered that Jesus was with them all the time. In Holy Communion, we remember that Jesus is with us all the time. We remember his presence. We remember he's raised from the dead and he lives and walks and reigns with us. We remember that in the breaking of the bread. All right, so how did this encounter with Jesus change these disciples? What happened to them, these two, after they had seen Jesus raised? I mean, they'd been terrified and distraught and traumatized and fearful and uncertain and depressed and despondent. You know how they changed? Suddenly, they saw that Jesus was alive, and that transforms everything. It gave them hope. It said to them, as we have said already, that Easter is God's way of saying in the end that light overcomes darkness, right? They saw that. It was visible at the table. Light overcame darkness. Love overcame hate, and life conquered death. It says that there is always hope. And as we often say around here, the worst thing is never the last thing. Even Jesus' torture and death was not the end of the story. Easter is God's way of addressing the pain and the brokenness in our lives. God's way of saying, no matter what happens in your life, I am with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. And no matter what happens, somehow it's going to be okay if your life is in my hands. That's what Easter tells us. And that's part of why we need Easter now more than ever. Evil, hate, sin, and death, none of them have the final word. Coronavirus, COVID-19, doesn't get to have the final word in a world in which Christ has been raised from the dead. In Easter, we see something else. Not only that God has the ultimate and final word, but we also see that God has this capacity to take evil and suffering and hate, and he wrings, like you'd wring out a dish rag, he wrings good from that evil. He bends and forces it to accomplish his purposes, so that Christ is crucified, tortured to death, and this isn't God's will, although in some sense it is, because he knows what he's going to do with it. But it isn't God's will to torture and to hurt anybody. But God knows this is going to happen, and God says, I can take that and do something with it, so that through the cross as Christ hangs there, the world might see that Christ is offering himself to God for our sins. Here I am, God, on behalf of these people, forgive them. And so we recognize the brokenness, the punishment that we deserve is borne by Jesus on the cross. We look at it and we see our brokenness when we see him die on the cross. We recognize when he hangs on the cross the love of God as he says, this is how much I love you. Greater love has no one than this, that they lay down their life for their friends. And then he says, now this is what love looks like and what I'm hoping for from you. God takes this horrible act of torture and he transforms it and makes it into a thing of beauty that saves us and delivers us. Resurrection makes that possible. Were it not for the resurrection, we wouldn't know that about the crucifixion. But the resurrection gives us hope and transforms suffering into something good and beautiful, redemptive, if you will. So Jesus' death and resurrection is our defining story. For Christians, this is how we see the world. We see it through the lens of Jesus' death and resurrection. We believe that there is always hope, always hope. James Stewart, one of the great Scottish preachers of the last century, once said this about the resurrection: the most characteristic word of the Christian religion is the word resurrection. If you had to choose one word to gather up and focus and express the very essence of the New Testament faith, this would be your choice. This, in fact, according to the Bible, is what Christianity essentially is, a religion of resurrection. It is what the gospel offers today to this dark and ruined world. He's writing back in 1975, to this dark and ruined world where men peering into the future are daunted by the well-nigh impossible task of creating order out of chaos and life out of death. The power of the resurrection makes that possible. How we need that today in this period of time. Now, I was speaking to a young man recently. He was baptized in this church as a baby, and he's now off at college. And he'd written me a note and just said, Pastor Adam, I've got questions. I have a friend who's an atheist, and some of the things he says are making sense to me. And, do you think we could talk? And I'm like, yeah, I'd love to talk to you. And so we had a Zoom call this last week, a really great guy. And we began to talk through some of his questions, and he raised several questions. And, we just had a great conversation, and I loved his spirit and his heart. And partway through, he said, well, one thing is it would be so much easier to believe in God if we could just see him, like if he would just show up. Like, if we could just see him showing up, then it would be so easy to believe. Why doesn't that happen? Or do you see God, Pastor Edmund? Where do you see him? And I said, well, I see him all the time. I see God all the time when I look at the world that's so beautiful and magnificent, and I see the stars in the heavens, or I see the creatures here below, or I listen to the birds singing, I see the flowers on the trees blooming, and I see the handiwork of God and all of that, and that all points to a God who is good and loving and has created all these things. I see God when I look at Jesus, because Christians believe that in Jesus, God came and walked among us. So I read the Gospels every day, and as I read the Gospels, I see Jesus, and through Jesus, I see God. But I said, where else I see God? I see God in people. Remember, we were created in the image of God, and so we're meant to be a reflection of the likeness of God. And I said, when I see people who are following Jesus and trying to live their lives for him, I see God in them. And I feel God through them. And I said, of course I feel God when I pray and I worship. But I want you to particularly think about how you see God through other people. And I want you to think about that today. And that's really where I want to begin to wrap this sermon up, is I want us to recognize that the God who created everything, who permeates everything, is seen visibly incarnate in the love that we have for each other. This week, one of our families lost their son to suicide. And I had to see them. We're not supposed to be making calls, but I said, can I just come and we can sit 10 feet apart from each other? And so they said, yeah, come around, to the back of the house and come up on the back deck, and we can sit 10 or 15 feet apart, and we really would love to see you, Pastor Adam. And so I went and I walked around the back of the house, and as I walked around, before I got to the steps of the deck, there I saw Brian and Cindy Legree. And it sort of stopped me in my tracks for a moment, and then I thought, no, of course. They were out back planting flowering plants for this family. You see, Brian and Cindy had lost their daughter in the summer of 2018, and they knew what it was like to experience pain and brokenness and heartache, and they still live with that. But somehow God had redeemed that in their lives, had taken that painful thing and had turned that into a heart of compassion for anyone else who was suffering from the loss of a child, and they couldn't not show up with plants, even though there was a stay-in-place order to try to let this family know that you are loved and that there is hope. Here's a picture of them I took. And I just love their smiles. And there's a lot of pain too that they still carry with them, but there's joy, and that joy is now found in serving other people. And this is that redemption that happens, and this is the hope of the resurrection. And this is how God works in our lives. Last week, I got a note from a physician at KU Med Center. She and her husband are both doctors. They have two little children, one who's about a year old, and the other one is about 2 years old. Her name is Hannah Peterson. And Hannah wrote this to me. She said, right now, she serves on the COVID-19 unit at the hospital. You got to know, her mom is living with her to take care of the kids, so she's got a mom she's worried about, and her children she's worried about, her husband, and yet she's going into the hospital every day into a place where there are people who are very sick. And she says, right now I'm having to dig deep to be brave, Pastor Adam. The atmosphere at the hospital feels different. Everyone is more on edge as we are in the beginning stages of our surge here in Kansas City. But when I struggle the most to combat my anxiety, I have to lean hard into my faith and trust that God is with me. And then I love this. She said, my prayer is to be an expression of the love of Christ to the people I'm caring for. This young doctor, and this is her prayer, that when she goes in the hospital, that she can be an expression of the love of Christ. She said, the people can't have visitors anymore. And so she said, all they have is us, the orderlies, the nurses, the doctors. And this is my prayer. Lord, please use me to minister to them. And in the process of doing that, she finds the fear begins to dissipate, and she finds joy begins to come in. This is a resurrection faith that says, you know what? Even if I get sick, somehow it's going to be okay. And I am yours, O Lord. Use me, I pray. Just before this service, I received a note Pastor Scott shared with me from one of our Resurrection Downtown folks. She's a nurse, and she said, I cried in Target today. In the greeting aisle, I was picking out cards for my girls. Tomorrow morning, I'm packing my car and heading to New York to help with the COVID crisis there. I'll be gone 6 weeks, and I've never been away from my family more than a week. We're better together, but that isn't possible at this time. And then she goes on to describe, her hope that her friends and family will care for, her husband and her children during this time. And I'm thinking, who is it who isn't required to, but loads up her car and travels, to New York in the middle of this crisis, in the center of the coronavirus and the COVID-19, whirlwind, and says, I'm going to spend 6 weeks caring for people. That is a resurrection faith. That is the hope that we have in Christ. It says the worst thing is never the last thing, and here I am, Lord, and please use me. She is embodying, she is incarnating the light and love of Christ, the resurrection, and what she's doing, just as the doctor at KU Med Center is doing, and as so many of you are doing. I asked one of the CEOs of an area hospital here in Kansas City, what can we do as a church to be encouraging your staff? How can we encourage the folks who are cleaning the floors and the folks who are making the meals? And he said, one thing we heard a church did in another city was to make like real estate signs that they put out in front of the hospital where the staff would drive by and they would just encourage them with these words. And I said, we can do that. And so we ordered 1,000 of these signs, and we had, kits with colored magic markers, and we had we had people ready. They took them all instantly. We have 70 hospitals in Kansas City that are getting these signs, most of them 10 or 15 signs in front of each of these hospitals. And I wanted you to see some of them. These were just taken out the last couple days. So thank you, you're making a difference, and we are praying for you, in front of these different hospitals. And I love this. You've got the mask and the gloves. We're sending prayers and love. And thank you for your sacrifice today. Isn't that beautiful? And here at Providence Health Medical Center, healthcare workers are the best, and thank you. And all of these other signs in front of the urgent care center there, and these three guys in front of Olathe Medical Center, grateful for you, you're amazing. And I can't read the other one, but I just love the fact that these signs are out there. And these two were actually made by doctors. These were at KU Med Center, and they were made by doctors and left for the cleaning crew at night. Thank you, cleaning crew. You are more than essential, and we are grateful, and we appreciate your sacrifice. Let me ask you a question. What are you doing to encourage other people right now? It's just not that hard. There are ways that you can do that, whether it's emails or notes or making signs like this. Next week, I got another 1,000 signs coming in so that we can take them to the first responders, and we can take them to the grocery stores and other places where people are still working. I'm wondering if some of you might say, hey, I want to do that too. Let me in on the action. I want to be a part of that. And there's 1,000 other ways that you can be caring for other people right now. I want to share with you one of the other ideas they had was to have our resurrection members show up in the parking lot at shift change. They'd seen this in another city, and they said, do you think your folks would come up there? And that maybe they could make signs, and they could just honk their horns, and by honking their horns, they could be saying to our staff as they're leaving and making the shift change, coming or going, that we care about you and we're praying for you. And I said, man, I know our people would do that. And we had to limit how many people could go. We had room for 230 cars, and that's what we did. We filled the parking lot with these cars. And I wanted you to see what happened this last Tuesday night. Take a look.
Just finished a walk and came out with a bunch of different people. We are at Advent Health at 75th and Antioch, and we are here to bless all the healthcare workers who are fighting the COVID virus. There's a shift change that's going to happen very shortly, and this parking lot is completely filled with members of Church of the Resurrection who are honking their horns and playing awesome music and holding up posters and signs. So many of you know I've worked in healthcare for almost 10 years and most recently transitioned out of healthcare, but my heart is still here, and I just appreciate everything that everyone's doing. There's some staff members. They're waving from the windows and they're thanking everybody for being here, but if ever you doubted that we would get through this, you just have to see this parking lot. It's just amazing.
I love that. If you ever doubted we would make it through this, you just got to see this because it's amazing. What was amazing is you had all those people who showed up and they are reflecting the love of a resurrected Christ. They are saying, you know what, we're going to make it through this, and we're with you, and we stand with you. And they were letting Christ's light shine through them because Christ is most often seen through his people. I want to mention one fun thing that we did this last week. So, we're not allowed as a church to buy alcohol, but last week I actually, worked out to be able to buy 50 gallons of pure grain alcohol, 190 proof. And somebody said, yeah, you're a bootlegger for Jesus now. And not exactly, but we had one of our doctors who said, hey, I think we need to make sanitizer for the homeless shelters and other places that don't have access to it because it's really hard to get here in Kansas City right now. And so we bought 50 gallons of pure grain alcohol. And we had a whole team of people come up. Here's a picture of them, and they're transforming it according to the World Health Organization's recipe into hand sanitizer. I think we've got about 2,000 bottles that we're making for various organizations here in Kansas City. We're doing a ton of other stuff besides this. I'm just giving you scratching the surface. But part of what I love in all of this is it gives us a picture of what Jesus was up to and what he was asking of us. He tests those disciples when he's standing there at Emmaus, and here he is, a stranger, and he's getting ready to walk on. He may be hungry, but he's getting ready to walk on. He wants to see what they're going to do. And let me just remind you, Jesus said this in Matthew chapter 25 about the last judgment. He says he's going to gather in the last day all of the people on earth, and he's going to separate them as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And then he's going to say to the sheep, who he's going to invite into his eternal home, he's going to say, I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. You gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, remember, he was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. And the righteous will say, when did we do this for you, Lord? And he said, inasmuch as you did this to the least of these, you did it unto me. Hey, you've been giving generously to people who are in need. Actually, you always do this. I love this about you, church. So in the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've given away $124,000 in grants so far. The first $100,000 of the Easter offering, is going towards grants, more grants, to people who are serving low-income people in the greater Kansas City area. You've given thousands of meals. You've done too much stuff I could even tell you. But 20 different organizations have gotten these grants. And I wanted you to hear from 3 of the organizations who've gotten grants, who you have been helping for a long time and will continue to be helping through our Easter offering. Take a listen.
We house families and individuals in their own apartment that's rent and utility free on an effort to help them become self-sufficient. So our needs are going to increase about twofold. And then on the backside, when we get through this crisis, we're going to have more families that are in need for permanent housing. Church of the Res has actually increased their donations to us for our food pantry that helps us buy protein and fresh fruits and vegetables for the families we serve. We know that we're going to need more of those things, and Church of the Resurrection has already increased their giving and helped us with that.
2 weeks ago, Crossline served over 1,400 people in 1 week, going through over 4,200 pounds of food. That's usually what we go through in a month. So we have seen a huge increase, and just our ability to keep food on our shelves is becoming increasingly difficult. Without our partnership with Church of the Resurrection, Crosslines would not be able to do what we're doing right now. We would not be able to serve 1,400 people in less than a week.
I have been out here 13 years serving the urban core, and I've never seen the demand. The amount of food, diapers, cleaning products, essential hygiene items that are needed right now, it's incredible. Our entire facility has been flipped to be just a distribution center, and how to move the products as quickly as possible to the door of the families in need. So I've continued to see you guys do radical things and to do things that are making huge impact in our city, and for that I'm just so grateful.
Why are we doing this? Why are we spending so much money and time to make sure we have food drives every Friday, pop-up food drives? Why are we doing this? Because Jesus was known in the breaking of the bread. Because when we show up in Christ's name and we offer food to people, not preaching at them, just trying to embody the love of Christ, people see Jesus through us, and they find love and they find hope through the breaking of the bread. Otherwise, I was walking into church just now. I received this email from Mayor Quentin Lucas in Kansas City, Missouri. He said, the Resurrection community has shown the immense power of serving thy neighbor, of faith in action, of prayer and faith in the Lord. Thank you for all the love that your community pours into our community throughout the region. I'm grateful for all you do. I wish you a blessed Easter, and I look forward to worshiping together in person soon. And I believe he's going to be with us this weekend for Easter worship as well. So one last little idea, this is something we're getting ready to do, and some of you might want to help with this, is we asked some of the doctors, nurses, hospital executives, some of the custodians and other people, hey, what could we do to really bless you, to encourage you? And some people said, hey, it'd be really great if we had a really nice meal that was brought in, and maybe we wouldn't have to eat at the cafeteria for one time, and we could just, not that the cafeteria food is bad, it's great food, but maybe that would be a thing, and maybe there could be notes, to each of us. And so we're gonna do that for a number of area hospitals. Those who want us to do this, we're gonna be providing a $10 box meal, a really nice meal in a box, and a note inside that encourages them just to say, this meal is an expression of our love and our gratitude for you and of the hope that you have. And as they eat those meals and they know they came from us, I think Christ will be known in the breaking of the bread. I want to encourage you to consider doing this last thing, and that is you're going to have a meal today. And you're not going to have usually we have like 30 people over for Easter meal at our house. It's just Lavana this time. And so I want to encourage you, would you set an extra place setting at your table? People used to do this all the time. Set an extra place setting at your table, and I want you to imagine Jesus is there. I want you to invite him to eat with you. I want you to remember that he's with you all the time, but by having that place setting there, just to imagine Jesus is joining you as he did as a stranger with the disciples at Emmaus. And I'd love for you to pray before you eat, and just to stop and say, thank you, Lord. Thank you for everything. Thank you for your suffering and death on the cross for me. Thank you for your resurrection that gives us hope. Thank you that you walk with us even through the valley of the shadow of death. Thank you that you are with us all the time. Thank you that you bring good from evil. Give us hope. Give us courage for the living of these days. Help us to, O Lord, honor and serve you and to care for your people. You pray as you think about it, but I just want to invite you to consider at your Easter meal this day to have an extra place setting and to pray and to remember that Christ is with you, and to see him in the breaking of the bread at your table. Tuesday nights, I'm doing a Vespers on Facebook Live, and the first night I did this, it's just to encourage people, 8 o'clock at night Central Time. I shared this story, this little quote. It's a quote that I haven't shared since the Sunday after the World Trade Towers fell. And it seemed appropriate then, it seems appropriate now. It's from Winston Churchill. You've maybe heard this recently, but it was a speech that he gave June 18th, 1940. The Nazis had overrun France. They were on their way to attack Great Britain, and he's trying to rally the people and give them courage to fight and to fight and to fight. And this is how his quote ends. He says, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour." I wonder if this will be your finest hour. I wonder how God is going to take all of this and in your life use it to bring about something good and beautiful. I wonder if you're going to be scared and hunker down and become more self-absorbed, or if this is a time where you can become more engaged with God, more open to God's work, selfless and able to share, in which character is built in your life because you've trusted that Christ was risen and you've lived like it. My hope and prayer is that this season will be one of our finest hours. For the last 30 years, I've ended the Easter sermon the same way every year. Many of you are prepared for this. People ask me from time to time. Just 2 months ago, I had somebody ask me this. Come on, Adam, you're a smart guy. You don't really believe this whole resurrection bit, do you? Like Jesus was dead and he was put in the tomb and he laid there for 36 hours and then he walked out of the tomb alive. Do you really believe that? And do you really believe that when we die, we get to go to some place where it's happy and where there's joy and we get to be reunited with family and friends, there's light and life? And really, do you believe that? And my answer is always the same. I not only believe it, I'm counting on it. And you can too. Let's pray. God, how grateful we are to you that you sent Jesus to show us the way, the truth, and the life. That he suffered and died on the cross, and you took that horrible act of tragic pain and you redeemed it. You just wrought from it something beautiful and good. Our forgiveness, mercy, and grace. How grateful we are for Christ's resurrection from the grave that tells us that the worst thing is never the last thing and that there is always hope. That evil, hate, sin, death, and even coronavirus will never have the final word. Lord, help us to trust you. And we pray that you would take this time of uncertainty and in our lives, help us to trust you even more. Help us, O Lord, not to become more self-absorbed, but instead to become more selfless. And help us, O Lord, to be a reflection of your light, your love, and your resurrection. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for watching this week's sermon. We'd love for you to join us again online or live in worship. To learn more about Church of the Resurrection, please visit core.org. Have a great week.